last, the sun began to dip, and the air, though still warm, softened. Shadows stretched long across courtyards, and the overseer's tallies were marked complete. Tools were collected, stacked neatly where they would be fetched again tomorrow. For the slave, this was the slow easing of pressure, not freedom, but the loosening of the grip, the difference between a clenched fist and an open hand. Evenings did not bring luxury. Housing was simple. Often no more than mud brick huts clustered together near the edge of fields or quarries. The walls held the heat from the day, releasing it slowly as night fell. Roofs were flat, sometimes used as sleeping platforms in the hotter months, where the faint breeze was easier to catch. Inside, space was cramped, reed mats for bedding, a jar or two for water, perhaps a clay lamp if oil could be spared. Privacy was rare, but togetherness was constant. Families, companions, children, all lived pressed close. Meals were modest, built from the same rations given each morning. Bread, onions, a little beer if it had been brewed. On better days, dates or fish shared between many hands. Yet it was in these meals that something shifted. The bread might taste the same as at dawn, but now it was eaten without overseers watching, without tools waiting nearby. It was chewed more slowly, savored as a pause, as a moment of choice. Who sat beside whom, who received the larger piece, who was offered a sip of beer. These were small acts of agency, small gestures of care. And then came talk. Gossip filled the narrow spaces between huts, news of overseers, of scribes, of distant temples. Nicknames were whispered, sometimes mocking, sometimes affectionate, a way of reclaiming individuality in a system that tallied people as numbers. Stories were told, myths of gods traveling through the night sky, tales of animals who spoke like men, accounts of long ago pharaohs who listened to prayers. These stories were not only entertainment, they were escape. For the length of a tale, the day's labor dissolved, and listeners were transported elsewhere, to a riverbank, to a palace, to a land where choice was freer. Songs, too, carried into the night, not always formal hymns, but work chants reshaped into melodies, or lullabies sung to children. Music gave rhythm to the hours after labor, a reminder that voices could still rise together for something other than commands. Some tapped reed flutes or struck jars to create a beat, soft and steady. Others simply hummed while staring at the stars. These were tiny luxuries too. A jar of water left to cool in the shade all day, now poured and shared. A breeze passing across a roof where children slept. A laugh that broke into the stillness, contagious enough to ripple through the huts. These were not grand freedoms, but they were freedoms nonetheless. Sparks of humanity that kept dignity alive. Friendships deepened in these hours. Shared labor created bonds. Shared hardships wove them tighter. A companion who offered to take your turn at the burned stove. A neighbor who passed your mat with spare reeds. A child who pressed a flower into your hand. These gestures carried no record in the overseer's ledger, but they mattered more than any tally. They reminded each person that they were not only a worker, not only a servant, but still a being capable of giving and receiving kindness. The sky above became part of the evening rhythm, without lamps to drown it. The stars stretched endless. People lay back on rooftops or in courtyards, pointing out Orion, Sirius, the belt of the sky goddess, not arsing overhead. The same stars that guided travelers across deserts now guided weary eyes into sleep. To look at them was to remember that the world was larger than one station, that even a life bounded by rules and rations could still glimpse infinity. And so evening was not an end, but a breathing space. The day still belonged to others, but the night allowed the soul to remember itself. In laughter, in songs, in story, in silence under stars, people reclaimed something that had nearly been taken from them. But always the question lingered. Could it ever be more than a breathing space? Could service end? Could a slave hope for freedom? The record says yes, but rarely. And so our journey ends by looking at the fragile hope, manumission, release, and the idea of freedom that flickered like a distant flame. Even as laughter faded and stars wheeled overhead, the question remained: could a life lived under a command ever change? Could a person bound by rations, rules, and roll calls ever step beyond them? For most, the answer was no, but the idea of freedom lingered, passed in whispers at night, carried in stories, recorded faintly in law. Egyptian records tell of tales who were freed. Sometimes it came as a gift from a master, a reward for loyalty, or for service so long and steady it could no longer be ignored. Sometimes it came by purchase, a family saving slowly, piece by piece, until they could buy back one of their own. Debt slaves could sometimes see release when the balance was repaid, though often the burden outlasted the debtor's lifetime. And there were rare manumission decrees, when a pharaoh or noble declared a group of slaves free in a gesture of piety or power. But these cases were exceptions. For the vast majority, freedom was imagined more often than experienced. The hope of it lived in evening songs, in stories told to children, in dreams shared beneath stars. It lived in nicknames, in moments of laughter, in small choices that reminded a person they still had a self. Freedom was not always a formal decree. Sometimes it was the act of saving a crust of bread to share, or humming a tune no one had ordered, or choosing who to sit beside when rations were eaten. These were sparks, fragile, fleeting, but they carried the warmth of freedom within them. To the Egyptians, life was measured not only in what was endured, but in balance, in ma'at, the order that kept sun and river, grain and stars, in harmony. For slaves, balance was harder to grasp, bent by control and repetition. Yet they still shouted in small ways, a fair exchange of food, a shared story, a moment of cool water. These were acts of keeping Mahat alive, even when the day seemed to press it down. And so, the day ends where it began, not with choice, but with summons, from the first sally at dawn to the last whisper under starlight. The hours of a slave in ancient Egypt were shaped by others. The body was commanded, the speech restricted, the rations measured. Tools were placed in hands each morning, and labor carried on until the sun dropped again. Yet, within that narrow frame, people still carved out spaces of humanity. They sang, they laughed, they traded favors. They told stories that lifted them beyond courtyards and quarries, carrying them to lands where animals spoke and gods listened. They found dignity in nicknames, in bonds, in the constellations traced across the night sky. To say you would not survive a day as an Egyptian slave is not only to speak of the heat, the dust, the repetition. It is to admit how little agency modern minds would bear, how heavy those invisible rules would feel, how strange it would be to measure freedom not in declarations but in sparks. A sip of cool water, a laugh shared, a story remembered. For those who lived it, survival was a skill, practiced daily, and while manumission was rare, While freedom was mostly dream, the spirit did not vanish. It found light in evenings, in stars, in small gestures that kept balance alive. From first light to last dust, the day was not their own, but within it, sparks endure. And sometimes, sparks are enough to light a life.